During the caching section, I talked a little bit about static versus dynamic and how they interact with the cache. And in this video, I want to go more in depth on the differences between static and dynamic. And luckily, this is a relatively easy concept to understand. So to get started, I have quite a few pages created. I have this home page, which just has no data at all in it. It's just a single H1. So we can see what just a pretty much static page looks like. Then I have a page here that has a parameter being passed in. You can see that the path for this is to-dos / whatever my dynamic to-do ID is. So this requires a dynamic URL parameter. Then we have this revalidate 5. So this has a revalidation time of 5 seconds. We have a revalidation time of 0 seconds. And then finally, I have this page, which is called force dynamic. So it's forcing it to render dynamically, essentially. Now, in order to determine if a page is going to be dynamically rendered or statically rendered, there's a few different things you can look at, but the easiest way is to just run the build command, because the build command will actually tell you exactly which pages are static and which pages are dynamic. So if you're unsure what a page is going to be at build time, you can just run this build command, and you can see any page that has a circle next to it is considered static, and any route that has this lambda symbol next to it is going to be dynamic. So if we scroll up here and we just expand this a little bit so it's a little easier to read, you can see here that our home route, the one that just has no data, is a static route, which makes sense. It does nothing. It's literally just a page with an H1. You can see our not found, which we don't actually have created, but the default one is going to be considered static. You can see our page that we've marked as dynamic is going to be a dynamic page. And I'm actually going to rerun this because it looks like not all of my pages are showing up inside of here, probably to do with the reformatting of changing the size of my actual screen. We're just going to let that run again. And now you can see we have all of our pages showing up. So you can see the one that we've labeled as dynamic, this page here where we said force dynamic, you can see that this is a dynamic page. And you can see here the one that has a revalidate of 0 is also considered dynamic. And essentially, because when you set revalidate to 0, you're essentially saying every time you access the page, get new data. So revalidate 0 and setting the dynamic to force dynamic, they pretty much do exactly the same thing when it comes to static versus dynamic. Now our revalidate 5 page is actually considered static. The reason this is a static page and not a dynamic page, even though the data changes every 5 seconds, is because between those 5 seconds, the output is exactly the same every single time until those 5 seconds expires, and then it just rebuilds a brand new static version of the page. And this is because a dynamic page is a page that regenerates itself every single time the user requests the page, no matter what. A static page, on the other hand, uses a pre-built version to send down to the user and only rebuilds itself when it needs to. For example, if you invalidate your cache or your revalidation time runs out or something similar to that. The dynamic pages will always re-render every time you access that route, while static pages will most likely just give you a static result instead of going through the full re-render process. So generally, static pages are better for performance, but obviously not everything can be static. For example, this page here for our to-dos is a dynamic page because we have to rerun this every time we get a request because our to-do ID could change. Now, by default, Next.js will try to render all of your pages as static pages. That's why this page right here, which we did nothing to, is rendered as a static page. And it's only when you start to use dynamic features or forcefully tell Next.js that you want to use a dynamic page that it'll actually render out dynamic content. And we can actually see a little chart here that kind of explains exactly what I'm talking about. So if we just scroll down here a little ways, you can see that I have this chart talking about dynamic functions, and you can see here that it determines whether or not we're going to statically render or dynamically render out this page. So if, for example, we do not use any dynamic functions, which is something I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but think of this as like cookies, search params, headers, different things that change on each request. If you don't use those and all of the data that you're using is cached, well, then it's going to statically render the page. Otherwise, in every other situation, it's going to dynamically render the page. So anytime you have a dynamic function, the page is going to be a dynamic page, or anytime that your data is not cached. So for example, inside of our page here where we have our to-do, which is coming in here from our to-do ID, this is not going to be in the cache. When we have revalidate 0, not in the cache, or when we force a page to be dynamic, again, it's not stored in the cache. So this is where caching really heavily ties into dynamic versus static, because if something is not cached, it can never be rendered as a static asset, and it must always be dynamic. While if it's in the cache and you're making sure you're not doing anything else dynamic, like getting cookie information, for example, it's going to render that as a static page. And the important thing to understand about this dynamic versus static is it's not just based on exporting variables or whatever, it's really just interacting with the cache. So you just determine, does this page have all of its data cached and does it not use any dynamic functions? If so, it's going to be static. So for example, we can just come to this page where I have revalidate 5. You can see that right now this is considered a static route because all of my data is cached at least for 5 seconds. But if I change this getToDo's function to actually remove the caching, so I just come in here and I pass the next option here, and I set revalidate to 0, that essentially removes the ability to cache this information, and I redo my build process, you'll now notice that all of my pages that import getToDo's are now going to be dynamic pages. So you can see here, this revalidate 5 has changed from a static to a dynamic page because the actual getToDo's fetch function is overwriting my revalidate value to 0, which takes this out of the cache. Now, for the most part, this isn't really something that you need to worry about, but if you're doing things that by default don't go into the cache, you may run into problems with getting a statically rendered page. For example, I'm going to create a brand new folder. We're going to call this random, and I'm just going to create a page. And I'm going to export default function random. And this is just going to return an h1, which is just math.random. Make sure we get that in there. So now this is just going to return a random number and put it inside of an h1. So if we were to just npm run dev and we go to our application at random and I hit enter, you're going to notice we get a random number, and I refresh, I get a brand new random number, and it seems like everything is working just fine. But the problem is the way that this works when you actually build your site. And that's because in development, essentially everything is dynamically rendered just to make it easier for you when you're developing. But let's go ahead and actually build this. So we can run the build command, and you'll notice that this random page that we just created is actually going to be a static page, which means it never updates its value. If you can see here, we have that random page, it's considered static. So now if I just npm run start to actually start up the version of my application that we have, and I just go to this page, you'll see we get 0.729, and if I refresh, I get the exact same value, and I refresh again, I get the same value, and it's always going to be the same value because this has been statically rendered. So I essentially need to tell Next.js, hey, this is actually a dynamic page, and that's a perfect use case for exporting that constant variable dynamic and just setting this to force dynamic, and now Next.js essentially is forced to make this page dynamic. So now if I rebuild this and then rerun it, you'll notice it actually properly updates my math random variable to a random number every time. As you can see here, this is now a dynamic page. And as we've already mentioned, dynamic pages run on every single render. So now here, every time I make a request, it reruns this function. And as you can see, I get a different random number every single time. Now there's also a handy function built into Next.js that's currently unstable, but it's going to become stable. And this is kind of an easy way for you to opt into dynamic pages on a per component or per function basis. Because right now I need to export this at the top of whatever file I'm using. But let's say that I have actually a component. So let's create a brand new folder called components. And inside of here, I'm going to create a new component and we're going to call it random number.tsx. And then I'm just going to take the code that I was using inside of my random page, copy it over, so we can actually render that out. So inside of my random number, export function random number. And essentially, I'm just going to return this exact same thing inside of here. And now inside of a page, let's just say a random page, my home page, I'm going to use that. So inside of my home page, I'm going to render out random number. There we go. So now if I try to build my application, you're going to notice I have a bit of a problem. And that's because this is not specified as a dynamic page at all. So it's going to render this as a static page. As you can see, my home page is a static page. So now it's no longer going to give me a random number every single time. So it's kind of annoying because I need to know that this random number component that I'm using is actually a random dynamic value. So I need to make sure that I put in here export const dynamic to force this to be dynamic. And now obviously when I build, this will be considered a dynamic page. But this is a bit of a problem, especially if this random number component is nested like 20 levels deep or it's from a third-party library that I don't even know about. So in order to get around this problem, what you can do instead is where you have code that you know should always be dynamic and never stored inside of any caching or anything like that, you can go to where that's being defined and you can just call a function called noStore. Now this is currently unstable, which is why it's prefixed with unstable noStore. And we just make sure we import this from the next cache. And what this does is it essentially tells Next.js that anything that imports this component or function cannot be stored inside of the cache and cannot be statically rendered. So now what we can do, go back to our page here, and you'll notice we no longer have any dynamic code in here. We don't have any mention of code being dynamic, but since we used that noStore variable or that function inside of here and we just called it, it makes Next.js aware of the fact that this should be dynamic. And now you can see that this route is dynamic. So if I were to npm start this code, and I just refresh my page over here on the home page, you'll notice every time I refresh, I get a brand new random number. While if I didn't have this unstable noStore and I just rerun my page, you'll notice it no longer actually works properly. So we'll give it a second to rerun. And then once that's finished rerunning, I'll give it a start. You'll notice it is a static page. And now when I refresh, I get the exact same static number every single time. So this is the importance of understanding this noStore function. This is really great to put in components that you know are going to be dynamic, but Next.js doesn't already know that. Or for example, if you have database calls, it's a really great place to put these as well, because now I can mark this as essentially a noStore. There we go. I can mark this just like that so that Next.js knows that this is something that it cannot statically render. You can also combine this with the caching if you want, or if you don't want to use the caching functions we talked about, you can just throw this in there to opt out of caching. You can even do this for fetch requests instead. For example, I don't really like the fact that you modify fetch inside of Next.js. So instead of modifying it like this, I could use this unstable noStore, and that'll do essentially the exact same thing as passing in a revalidate of 0 or passing a cache of no cache. Now, this is a lot of stuff to cover inside of dynamic and static pages, but the important thing for you to understand for use cases is just that by default, Next.js will try to statically render everything, just like how it tries to cache everything by default, and it tries to render server side on default. Everything it's trying to do is trying to push things to the server, trying to push it to the cache, trying to statically render it, trying to essentially reduce the amount of work it has to do in the actual production environment. So just keep that in mind, that if you want something to be dynamic, you either need to make sure you're using dynamic functions or some other method that is going to make it dynamic, or you need to make sure you opt out of caching or tell it that it can't store this information to make sure it dynamically renders when it should be.